Welcome. It's a delight to be here. The subject that I've been given is the treatment of non-believers according to Islamic theology. You see, the West, in its sophistication, believes that it may be a one verse here, one verse there, and we can come to some kind of an agreement with the Muslims. And if those verses were taken out, then there would be no problem. So we create a topic like the treatment of non-believers according to Islamic theology. Meaning, if we find these paragraphs, we can omit them. Little we know that it isn't a verse or two. The whole Islamic system is the most sophisticated barbarism. The whole of it. There is nothing in it which is not barbaric. Every single part of the Quran. Can we put this down a bit? The voice, I think.
Not your voice.
Is, well, I don't know. Do we have a technician here who knows how to? Because the sound is very high.
I'm sorry, no technical in that respect. So, well.
The barbarism isn't about one verse, it is the whole part of it. And to understand the non-treatment, or the treatment of the non-believers in Islam, we are talking about life and religion. Therefore, we need to understand some basic principles about it. In Islam, the non-Islamic view of life is this. That's whole life. And to us as Westerners, religion is a tiny, weeny part of it. That is why we have free democracy. We have the religious rights. We have the right to preach, to believe, to be atheist, to be Christians, Buddhists, whatever you want to choose. Who you marry, how you eat, where do you go, where you sleep, everything is not regulated. But it is a personal, individual choice. The Islamic view, however, is that one is no longer life, but it is replaced by political religious system. Thank you. Can you put us down a bit, please? Yes, just the sound. Thank you. So, that political religious system declares and dictates everything in that life. So life is no longer the central concept of reality. Religious, political system is, which governs every aspect of that life. Therefore, the treatment of non-believers in this, if you are a non-believer, you are again under that system. So Islam isn't really as a religion, it is an all-encompassing system. It is not a religion in a Western sense of the word, it is not a faith, it is a system, a socio-political, socio-religious, educational, judiciary, legislative, militaristic system, cloaked and garbed in religious terminology. That's what Islam is. Now that you have understood something about its system, then let us consider the non-believers. First of all, who are the non-believers in Islam? Or by Islamic terms and its theology? Why are they regarded as rebellions? What have they done? And their treatment, therefore, it would follow naturally in our session. The Islamic theology, the treatment. What is its purpose? And the inner and outer display of their displeasure, forcing them into submission. So, few remarks about non-believers. Who are non-believers? Non-believers are not only Jews and Christians, but non-believers are all Buddhists. We don't have the time to categorize different people in, into as people or ethnic categories. And Professor Batior and Dr. Suder did a fantastic job, so I'm not going to repeat that. إنما المؤمنون الذين آمنوا بالله وبرسوله ولم يرتابوا وجاهدوا بأموالهم وأنفسهم في سبيل الله. The believers are only those who believe in Allah and in His Prophet. They never doubted, and they have supported or have declared jihad with their finances and with themselves. A believer, a non-believer in Islam is anybody and everybody who does not accept the finality of Muhammad and the abrogation of all other religions that came before Islam. Who does not believe in Allah and what Allah has given as a commandment. They are actually the opposite, completely opposite of the Muslims. الذين يأمرون المنكر. They are the ones who command vice. وينحون عن المعروف. And they forbid virtue. These are non-believers. Everything this parliament does is a vice. It's anti-Islamic. Everything that a Muslim does is a virtue. So, according to Surah 3 verse 110, كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنحون عن المنكر. Please give me a bit of sound because I'm putting strain on my throat. Thank you, officer. You are the best of the people brought about to mankind. You command good, you command virtue, you prohibit vice. And a non-believer is a contrary to Muslim. And according to Surah 9 verse 29, which most of you know it very well, الذين, those that do not believe, لا يؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخرة. They don't believe in Tawheed. They can be Jews, they can be Christians, they can be Buddhists, they can be anything, but they do not believe in Allah and His Messenger. ولا يحرمون ما حرم الله ورسوله. They do not forbid what Allah and His Apostle has forbidden. Therefore, they don't go by the Sharia. If they don't go by the Sharia, then they are non-believers. This is a mark. Of course, these are very few marks of a non-believer. الذين آمنوا, those who are believers, يقاتلون في سبيل الله. They fight, they struggle, they make effort, they pay everything for the sake of Allah. وَالَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. And all the kafirs, that is Mr. Chairman, you, me, everybody, every day. وَالَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا يُقَاتِلُونَ فِي سَبِيلَ الطَّاغُوتِ. They fight for the cause of the evil one, a monster. فَقَاتِلُوا أَوْلِيَاءَ الشَّيْطَانِ. So kill, slay all the enemies. They are the companions of Satan. They are satanic. Therefore, Allah has declared that there must be that concept. And of course, it is a commandment. وَكُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمَ الْقِتَالِ وَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. Allah has said, fighting, killing the enemy is being prescribed as a duty. Now, I don't want to divert. Islamic treatment. There are two forms of Islamic treatment. One is an inner treatment. Whether he is a moderate or not, that's not my business. As long as he and she is a Muslim, the DNA is instilled within their hearts to do something inner. Even if they don't lift up the soul, this is the inner motion, conscience, theology, instilled in a Muslim. And there is an outer form. Of course, after the Danish cartoon, you saw what happened to the Danish embassies across the world, what happened to Danish products, to your commerce, to your universities, and to your nationals. That's an outer one. Let's tackle the inner one first. Some of the inner one, and only very few I can give you. Enmity. All Muslims, Islam is not believed or based like the teaching of our glorious Lord Jesus Christ. We said, love your enemies. No, there is nothing called that. Forgiveness, no. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تتخذوا عدوي وعدوكم أولياء ولا تلقون بهم المودة. Or you who have believed, do not take my enemies, Allah is saying, my enemies and your enemies as your protectors, your friends, pay them any allegiance, and show them no love. أن تجد قوما يؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر يوادون من حاد الله ورسوله وإن كانوا آباءهم أو أبناءهم أو إخوانهم أو عشيرتهم. You will not find anyone who believes in Allah in the last day will show any affection, will show any love towards those who provoke, who resist the Apostle of Allah, meaning Muhammad, even if they be their parents, their kindreds, their brothers, or their kinsmen. So the resistance is all family ties, everything breaks down once a man or a woman becomes a Muslim. Never believe a Dane when he has become a Muslim that he's okay because he's Danish, he's got a blonde hair and he's got blue eyes. No way. He's a Muslim, that's it, finished. It's contaminated. They must not imitate a non-believer in any shape or form. They mustn't dress. Why? Where are all these? Go to Surah 60, for instance, you'll find the verse 4. نُكَفِّرُكُمْ. They said, now we declare you as apostates. وَقَدْ بَدَأَ بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَكُمَ الْعَدَاوَةَ وَالْبُغْضَاءَ أَبَدًا. An enmity, and hate has started between us forever and ever. There's no end to that. No. خَالِدِينَ فِي نَارَ جُهَنَّمْ أَبَدًا. Because they will be in hellfire forever and ever and ever. Therefore, there must be a covert and an overt war with them. For that war, we must prepare. وَعِدُّ لَهُمْ بِمَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ مِنْ قُوَّةِ وَرِبَاطِ الْخَيْلِ تُرْهِبُونَ بِهِ عَدُوَّ اللَّهِ وَعَدُوَّكُمْ. Make preparation with the steeds of war. Every kind of preparation. To fight, to cast fear, terror into the hearts of your enemies and my enemies, Allah says. Surah 8, verse 16. And of course, the whole Quran is saturated with the concept of hate. Hate of non-believers. Now, that concept, the outer form, the first before war starts is to cast terror. Terrorism is an Islamic doctrine. You may not believe it, but it is true. إِذْ يَوْحَى رَبُّكَ الْمَلَائِكَةَ إِنِّي مَعَكُمْ فَثَبِّتُوا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا فَسَأُلْقِي فِي قُلُوبِ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا الرُّعْبَ فَأَضْرِبُوا فَوْقَ الْأَعْنَاقِ. Allah inspired the angels and said to them, go and consolidate my believers, for I will cast terror into the hearts of the unbelievers. So you chop their necks off. ظنوا ما نعدهم حصونهم من الله فأتاهم الله من حيث لم يحتسبوا وقذف في قلوبهم الرعب. They thought they are cowards. Obama must hear. Their towers would protect them from Allah, but the wrath of Allah came to them from the least expected quarter and cast terror into their hearts. So Islam will have to cast terror into the hearts of every non-believer. This terror can take a variety of its forms. One, let me come and bring it home immediately. وَإِذْ لَقَيْتُمْ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا فَضَرْبَ الرِّقَابِ. When you find those who have unbelieved, the kafirs, they chop their necks. وَإِذَا أَخْذَفْتُهُمْ. If you find them and if you subdue them, then take them as hostage. Ransom them. Unless if it is good for Islam, in good forename Islam, would go advance Islam, then release them without a ransom. But it must be according to the Sharia. And then humiliate them until they have converted. After the Danish cartoon, any Danish man or woman was traveling with a Danish passport, be an Arab, be whoever, if they said, are you Danes loyal to your government against or for the cartoon? I can't make that decision. The cartoon is free in my country. I'm a Danish. He has the freedom, and I have no opinion. I can't give you my opinion. Officer, take him to prison. My esteemed brother here, friend, colleague, Sharif, at that time he was in the Middle East, the Gulf. Sir, did they imprison you?
Yes.
Because of the Danish cartoon?
Yes.
Any pains, and that one must not escape your mind. If you are abducted at the pyramids, you will be a hostage. Danish government will be attacked. Your planes will be attacked. Your commerce is under attack. And you are going to be weakened, because that is in Islamic Sharia. This is in the Quran. You must torture them, Allah said. قاتلوهم يعذبهم الله بأيديكم. Allah will punish them, will humiliate them, will torture them with your hands, with the hands of the believers. يخذيهم, he will humiliate them. وينصركم ويشفي صدور قوم المؤمنين. And he will heal the breast, the chest, and the hearts of the believers. They will say, Allahu Akbar. Yeah. That is the command of Allah. You wanted to know what Islamic theology teaches. You're not before a Muslim. And you are terrified in your chairs as you sit there. When you see them, you will know what the reality is. Victory and healing. Destroying their economy must be fully destroyed. You think, what's Muhammad that sophisticated? Oh, yes. It's in Surah 9, Surah 59, Surah Al-Hajj. Let me tell you the story behind it so that you relate to the incidents. Muhammad was in Khaybar. It was a Jewish rich oasis. It was a fantastic oasis in the middle of a desert. He besieged them. By now he had got rid of a whole Jewish tribe and slaughtered 800 of them. And he had come, now there was a siege, over 20 days or plus. And he came up with an idea. He said, you know why they are in these towers and in this siege and why we are in this position? It's not because of anything, but because their hearts are entangled with the palm trees, because of the fruit, because of their commerce, because of their prosperity. He said, begin to chop them. Burn down the trees. وَمَا مِنْ لَيِّنَةٍ تَرَكْتُمُوهَا فَبِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ. Whatever you left behind was with the permission of Allah. Whatever you destroyed was with the permission of Allah. Natural disasters attacking your resources is an Islamic principle. So for instance, Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman is now in prison, enjoying his leave. He issued a fatwa. He said, the government will be weakened because Egypt depends on the commercial income of the tourists. And so, it's a simple thing. Kill few tourists, abduct their buses, shoot them. You don't have to kill all of them, 4 or 5 will do. And when 20 tourists were hurt, buses were abducted, fire, machine guns were used, tourists disappeared. The Egyptian economy collapsed. What's the weak link in them? You know? You have to think strategically. You are extremely vulnerable. Extremely. So, your economy is not how they are going to treat. We are coming here, free press conference, we just want an intellectual talk, we then feel gratified, we think our mental capacity has been stimulated, what a fantastic afternoon. No, That's not my aim. I'm going to give it to you as it is. You'll be isolated. United States of America, the bastion of democracy. We have an American today. No undue respect to him. Not a single newspaper in the United States of America published the Danish cartoon. In Britain, not a single newspaper published the Danish cartoon. In Belgium, not a single newspaper was published by political parties, one or two, on the net, on their own magazines, but not in any newspaper. The Western powers isolated Denmark and said that is a Danish problem. But we bow to Islam. Inna ad-dina 'inda Allah al-Islam. The religion before Allah is Islam. وَمَنْ يَبْتَغِي غَيْرَ الْإِسْلَامَ دِينًا فَلَنْ يُقْبَلَ مِنْهُ وَهُوَ فِي الْآخِرَةِ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. The religion before Allah is Islam. And whosoever accepts any other, not religion, religion is a mistranslation of the word. System, philosophy, ideology, apart from Islam, will not be accepted of him here and in the life after. Will not be accepted of him means he will be humiliated, will be third, fifth, second class citizens, etc., etc. You pick up the professor's book about yours and you will learn much more than I can ever tell you. Allegiance. It isn't when Muslims will be majority. No. Allegiance is a concept. If you want to be a citizen of Europe, a citizen of Denmark, your allegiance must be to the Danish people, to the Danish government, and to the Danish parliament and its laws. Does Islam allow that? No. There is a whole doctrine in Islam called Aqidat al-Wala wal-Bara, a doctrine of allegiance and refutation. That, by the Sharia, declares that nobody, no Muslim can give an allegiance to a kafir, to an unbeliever. His allegiance is to Allah and the Prophet. So if the Danish are so sophisticated, so technologically advanced, that they have become superhumans and they say, a Dane can be anything, and a Muslim Dane will be elected as the Prime Minister. If he had the nuclear buttons, he would press it against his own people. I wouldn't trust him. That's that serious. Islam teaches that allegiance must be Allah and His Apostle only. La wala ghayr al-Muslim. There is no allegiance to a non-Muslim. This is an Islamic theology. And we have not talked about implementing it. The allegiance can come in increments. You say, we Danes would never do that. Foolish chap. Send him back wherever he came from. Well, I've got bad news for you.
Bad news?
Bad news. Your allegiance today in this country, because you don't think in those terms. All of you are eating halal meat, halal chicken. There is no other meat, no chicken except halal in Denmark. Because of your trade, you have to have it halal. There are so many products is run in this country by Islamic Sharia. So the nation already submits to Islam partially, in increments. When it comes to the final push, you will be so far out that you won't realize that you have a problem. See, I used to do it this way, I can do it now this way. Your allegiance will be to Islam. But no Muslim will have to give his allegiance to a non-Muslim. Never. So, this concept of allegiance. My time is gone, I've just put 2 or 3 minutes. Let me just show you this verse. This is what I already recited. And the issue of captives, ransom, and execution. It's all important. Your fellow citizen here lived through it, suffered through it, and was a guest. The generous hospitality of an Islamic country's prison, as far as Danes are concerned. It is not their treatment to you, but it is your treatment to yourself. The ultimate question is not how Islam treats the non-believers, but do you have that moral courage? Do you have that stamina? Do you hold on to something? The Judeo-Christian heritage, the freedom that their forefathers gave you, fought for it, and earned it in a hard way. It's telling me I'm 2 minutes ahead. So, my time is up. The question is, what are you going to hand over to the next generation? Yes. Are you the champions? As your forefathers were, they roamed the world and they almost conquered it. Denmark was no little country. It may be small today. It was small then. But the Danes spread its ideology across the world. Are you made of the same stock? Do you believe in the freedom that you breathe? You're coming a day when you wouldn't be able to breathe, literally breathe or eat a crumb of the bread without the permission of an imam. Unless you rise up, unless you understand, and it is no good giving a barbarian like me 20 minutes, because I'm not used to these 20-minute sessions. You need to make time. You need to organize seminars, appropriate seminars. Ask me hundreds of questions, and I'm prepared to invest in you. Mr. Chairman, this is a fantastic society. You have done a great job, and I extend to you my warmest thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Well, thank you, Sam. So this was the bad news. I'm sure that now we have Andy Bostom here. He's coming with the good news. So that's good.
Oh, that's it. I want to thank my intrepid friend, Lars Hedegaard, and the Danish Free Press Society for their gracious invitation to speak to you. It's an honor to be joined by esteemed colleagues such as Sam and Patrick Stoopdale. And I'm truly elated and humbled by the presence of my inspiration, a most generous mentor and dear friend, Baki Orr.
Absolutely. Here, here.
Here, here.
This relatively brief presentation is unsparing of germane details which pertain to Islamic doctrine and history. You may find the material somewhat dry when it is not disturbing. I ask your indulgence. I urge you to bear in mind Albert Einstein's admonition: if you're out to describe the truth, leave elegance to the tailor. A very dear Catholic neighbor, well aware of my writings on Islam, was kindly trying to lift my gloomy spirits of late. So he sent me some hackneyed Jewish humor, including short summary of every Jewish holiday. They tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. But the next example was more apposite to what I will discuss this afternoon. Jewish telegram. Begin worrying, details to follow. The only Marxist philosopher I appreciate, Groucho, once observed, beside a dog, a book is man's best friend. Inside a dog, it is too dark to read. Now I will cast light on subject matter long relegated to silent darkness. Dutch parliamentarian Geert Wilders' brief, powerful documentary film, Fitna, simply holds up a mirror to Islamic societies by including examples of how various Quranic verses are used by Muslim clerics and political leaders to incite Muslim populations to violence. And Fitna is entirely faithful to classical, mainstream Islamic exegesis on the Quranic verses cited in the film, regardless of what cultural jihadists and their witting or unwitting apologists and abettors may claim. Perhaps more disturbing than the images of jihadist carnage and their Quranic incitement portrayed in Fitna was an example of how even young children are inculcated with these genocidal beliefs and coached to repeat them for additional public consumption. Fitna included a May 2002 segment broadcast on Iqra, the Saudi satellite television station, which claims, by the way, at its website to, quote, highlight aspects of Arab Islamic culture that inspire admiration, to highlight the true tolerant image of Islam and refute the accusations directed against it, unquote. Iqra's The Muslim Women's Magazine program featured an interview of a 3.5-year-old, quote, real Muslim girl about Jews. When the little girl was asked whether she liked Jews, she replied, no. Asked why not, she replied that Jews were, quote, apes and pigs, unquote. The moderator then asked, who said this? And the child answered, our God. Where did he say this, asked the moderator. In the Quran, this 3.5-year-old girl replied. At the close of the interview, the moderator said approvingly, no parents could wish for Allah to give them a more believing girl than she. May Allah bless her, and both her and her father and mother. Tragically, this 3.5-year-old girl's Quranic reference is accurate. Quran 560 refers to the Jews as apes and pigs. Quran 265 and 7166 as apes only. These verses, and both their classical and modern exegesis by the most authoritative Muslim Quranic commentators, are meant to inspire sacralized Jew hatred. For over 1,000 years, since its founding in 792 CE, Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Egypt, has served as the academic shrine, much as Mecca is the religious shrine, of the global Muslim community. Al-Azhar and its mosque represent the pinnacle of Islamic religious education. A front-page New York Times story published Saturday, January 10, 2009, included extracts from the Friday sermon of the day before at Al-Azhar Mosque, pronounced by Egyptian government-appointed cleric Sheikh Eid Abdul Hamid Youssef, referencing well-established anti-Semitic motifs from the Quran, and I'll give you the citations below. Sheikh Youssef intoned the following: Muslim brothers, God has inflicted the Muslim nation with a people whom God has become angry at, Quran 1:7, and whom he cursed, Quran 5:78. So he made monkeys and pigs, Quran 5:60, out of them. They killed prophets and messengers, Quran 261, 3:112, and sowed corruption on earth, Quran 5:33, 5:64. They are the most evil on earth, Quran 5:62, 63. Indeed, the Quran's overall discussion of the Jews is marked by a litany of their sins and punishments as if part of a divine indictment, conviction, and punishment process. The Jews' ultimate sin and punishment are made clear. They are the devil's minions, Quran 4:60. Cursed by Allah, their faces will be obliterated, Quran 4:47. And if they do not accept the true faith of Islam, the Jews who understand their faith become Muslims, that's Quran 3:113. They will be made into apes, again, 265, 7:166, or apes and swine, 5:60, and burned in the hellfires, Quran 4:55, 5:29, 98:6, and 58:14-19. The Quranic curse upon the Jews for primarily rejecting, even slaying Allah's prophets, again, 261 and 3:112, including Isa, Jesus, or at least his body double. This is a complex motif, perhaps adapted from Gnostic Christianity, is updated with perfect archetypal logic in the canonical Hadith. Following the Muslims' initial conquest of the Jewish farming oasis of Khaybar, one of the vanquished Jewesses reportedly served Muhammad poisoned mutton or goat, which resulted ultimately in his protracted, agonizing death. And Ibn Sa'd's Sirah account, the Sirah, the earliest secularized biographies of Muhammad, Ibn Sa'd's Sirah account maintains that Muhammad's poisoning resulted from a well-coordinated Jewish conspiracy. It is worth recounting, as depicted in the Muslim sources, the events that antedated Muhammad's reputed poisoning at Khaybar. Muhammad's failures or incomplete successes were consistently recompensed by murderous attacks on the Jews. The Muslim prophet warrior developed a penchant for assassinating individual Jews and destroying Jewish communities by expropriation and expulsion, for example, the Banu Qaynuqa and the Banu Nadir, or massacring their men and enslaving their women and children, the Banu Qurayza. Just before subduing the Medinan Jewish tribe Banu Qurayza and orchestrating the mass execution of their adult males, Muhammad invoked perhaps the most striking Quranic motif for the Jews' debasement. He addressed these Jews with hateful disparagement as, quote, "you brothers of apes," unquote. Subsequently, in the case of the Khaybar Jews, Muhammad had the male leadership killed and plundered their riches. The terrorized Khaybar survivors, industrious Jewish farmers, became prototype subjugated dhimmis, whose productivity was extracted by the Muslims as a form of permanent booty or spoils. And according to the Muslim sources, even this tenuous vassalage was arbitrarily terminated within a decade of Muhammad's death when Caliph Umar expelled the Jews of Khaybar. Thus, Maimonides, who died in 1203, the renowned Talmudist, philosopher, astronomer, and physician, as noted by historian Salo Baron, emphasizes the bellicose madness of Muhammad and his quest for political control. Muhammad's mindset and the actions it engendered had immediate, long-term, tragic consequences for Jews, from his massacring up to 24,000 Jews to their chronic oppression, as described in the Islamic sources by Muslims themselves. And here is Barron's summary of Maimonides' conception. Following an apparently prevalent usage, Maimonides calls the founder of Islam a madman, and the Hebrew term is mashugga, with both religious and political aspirations, who failed to formulate any new religious ideas, but merely restated well-known concepts. Nevertheless, he attracted a large following and inflicted many wrongs upon the Jews, being himself responsible for the massacre of 24,000. Following his example, the Muslims of the subsequent generations oppressed the Jews and debased them even more harshly than any other nation, unquote. Muhammad's brutal conquest and subjugation of the Medinan and Khaybar Jews and their subsequent expulsion by one of his companions, the second rightly guided Caliph Umar, epitomized permanent archetypal behavior patterns Islamic law deemed appropriate to Muslim interactions with Jews. George Vida's seminal analysis of the anti-Jewish motifs in the Hadith, and I was privileged to bring this magisterial work from 1938 into English for the first time. It's in my compendium. Vida's seminal analysis of the Hadith remains the definitive work on this subject. Vida concluded that according to the Hadith, stubborn malevolence is the Jews' defining worldly characteristic. Rejecting Muhammad and refusing to convert to Islam out of jealousy, envy, and even selfish personal interest led them to acts of treachery in keeping with their inveterate nature. Sorcery, poisoning, assassination held no scruples for them. These archetypes sanctioned Muslim hatred towards the Jews, and the admonition to, at best, subject the Jews to Muslim domination as dhimmis, treated with contempt under certain humiliating conditions. Two particularly humiliating vocations that were imposed upon Jews by their Muslim overlords in Yemen and Morocco, where Jews form the only substantive non-Muslim dhimmi populations, merit elaboration. Moroccan Jews were confined to ghettos in the major cities, such as Fez since the 13th century, called mellas, salty earth, which derives from the fact that it was here that they were forced to salt the decapitated heads of executed rebels for public exposition. This brutally imposed humiliating practice, which could be enforced even on the Jewish Sabbath, persisted through the late 19th century, as described by Eliezer Bashan, and here's his description. In the 1870s, Jews were forced to salt the decapitated heads of rebels on the Sabbath. For example, Berber tribes frequently revolted against Sultan Muhammad XVIII. In order to force them to accept his authority, he would engage in punitive military campaigns. Among the tribes were the Musa, located south of Marrakesh. In 1872, the Sultan succeeded in quelling their revolt, and 48 of their captives were condemned to death. In October 1872, on the order of the Sultan, they were dispatched to Rabat for beheading. Their decapitated heads were to be exposed on the gates of the town for 3 days. Since the heads were to be sent to Fez, Jewish ritual slaughterers of livestock were forced to salt them and hang them for exposure on the Sabbath. Despite threats by the governor of Rabat, the Jews refused to do so. He then ordered soldiers to enter the homes of those who refused and drag them outside. After they were flogged, the Jews complied and performed the task, and the heads of the rebels were exposed in public, unquote. Yemenite Jews had to remove human feces and other waste matter, urine which failed to evaporate, etc., from Muslim areas, initially in Sana'a and later in other communities such as Shibam, Yarim, and Damar. Decrees requiring this obligation were issued in the late 18th or early 19th century and reintroduced in 1913. Yehuda Nini reproduces an 1874 letter by a Yemenite Jew to the Alliance Israelite in Paris, lamenting the practice. Here's a quote from that letter. "It is 86 years since our forefathers suffered the cruel decree and great shame to the nation of Israel from the east to sundown. For in the days of our fathers 86 years ago, there arose a judge known as Kadi, and said unto the king and his ministers who lived in that time, that the Lord, blessed be he, had only created the Jews out of love of the other nations, to do their work, and be enslaved by them at their will, and to do the most contemptible and lowly of tasks. And of them all, the greatest contamination of all, to clear the privies and streets and pathways of the filthy dung and the great filth in that place, to collect that all is left of that dung, may your honor pardon the expression." And when the Jews were perceived as having exceeded the rightful bounds of this subjected relationship, as in mythically tolerant Muslim Spain, the results were predictably tragic. The Grenadian Jewish viziers, Samuel ibn Negrella and his son Joseph, who protected the Jewish community, were both assassinated between 1056 to 1066. And in the aftermath, the Jewish population was annihilated by the local Muslims. It is estimated that up to 4,000 Jews perished in the pogrom by Muslims that accompanied the 1066 assassination. This figure equals or exceeds the number of Jews reportedly killed by the Crusaders during their pillage of the Rhineland some 30 years later, at the outset of the First Crusade. The inciting rationale for this Grenadian pogrom is made clear in the bitter anti-Jewish ode of Abu Ishaq, a well-known Muslim jurist and poet of the times, who wrote, quote, "Bring them down to their place and return them to the most abject station. They used to roam around us in tatters, covered with contempt, humiliation, and scorn. They used to rummage amongst the dung heaps for a bit of a filthy rag to serve as a shroud for a man to be buried in. Do not consider that killing them is treachery. Nay, it would be treachery to leave them scoffing." Unquote. Abu Ishaq's rhetorical incitement to violence also included the line, quote, "Many a pious Muslim is in awe of the vilest infidel ape," unquote. Moshe Perlman, in his analysis of the Muslim anti-Jewish polemic of 11th century Grenada, notes, quote, "Abu Ishaq used the epithet ape profusely when referring to Jews. Such indeed was the parlance." The Moroccan cleric Al-Maghili, who died in 1505, referring to the Jews as brothers of apes, just as Muhammad, the sacralized prototype, had addressed the Banu Qurayza. Who repeatedly blasphemed the Muslim prophet and whose overall conduct reflected their hatred of Muslims, fomented and then personally led a Muslim pogrom in about 1490 against the Jews of the southern Moroccan oasis of Tuat, plundering and killing them en masse and destroying their synagogue in neighboring Tamantin. An important Muslim theologian whose writings influenced Moroccan religious attitudes towards Jews into the 20th century, Al-Maghili also declared in verse, "Love of the prophet requires hatred of the Jews." Here is but a very incomplete sampling of barely known pogroms and mass murderous violence against Jews living under Islamic rule across space and time, all resulting from the combined effects of jihadism, general anti-Dhimmi, and/or specifically anti-Semitic motifs in Islam. 6,000 Jews massacred in Fez in 1033. Hundreds of Jews slaughtered in Muslim Cordoba between 1010 and 1015. 4,000 Jews killed in Muslim riots in Grenada, which I mentioned earlier, in 1066, wiping out the entire community. The Berber Muslim Almohad depredations of Jews and Christians in Spain and North Africa between 1130 and 1232, which killed tens of thousands while forcibly converting thousands more and subjecting the forced Jewish converts to Islam to a Muslim inquisition. The 1291 pogroms in Baghdad and its environs, which killed at least hundreds of Jews. The 1465 pogrom against the Jews of Fez. The late 15th century pogrom against the Jews of the southern Moroccan oasis town of Tuat. The 1679 pogroms against and then expulsion of 10,000 Jews from Sana'a, Yemen, to the unlivable hot and dry plain of Tihama, from which only 1,000 returned alive in 1680, 90% having died from exposure. Recurring Muslim anti-Jewish violence, including pogroms and forced conversions, throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, which rendered areas of Iran, for example, Tabriz, Judenrein. The 1834 pogrom in Safat, in the Galilee, where raging Muslim mobs killed and grievously wounded hundreds of Jews. The 1888 massacres of Jews in Isfahan and Shiraz, Iran. The 1910 pogrom in Shiraz, Iran. The pillage and destruction of the Casablanca, Morocco ghetto in 1907. The pillage of the ghetto of Fez, Morocco in 1912. The government-sanctioned anti-Jewish pogroms by Muslims in Turkish Eastern Thrace during June-July 1934, which ethnically cleansed at least 3,000 Jews. And the series of pogroms, expropriations, and finally mass expulsions of some 900,000 Jews from Arab Muslim nations, beginning in 1941 in Baghdad, the murderous Farhud, during which 600 Jews were murdered and at least 12,000 pillaged. Eventually involving cities and towns in Egypt, Morocco, Libya, Syria, Aden, Bahrain, and culminating in 1967 in Tunisia, that accompanied the planning and creation of a Jewish state, Israel, on a portion of the Jews' ancestral homeland. Unfortunately, contemporary manifestations of the jihad against Israel, linked intimately to Islamic Jew hatred and deemed radical, for example, Hamas's doctrine, are entirely concordant with the views espoused by the most authoritative religious educational institution within Sunni Islam, Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Egypt. Consider a fatwa written January 5th, 1956, at the height of so-called secular Arab nationalism, by then Grand Mufti of Egypt, Sheikh Hassan Mahmoud, and signed by the leading members of the Fatwa Committee of Al-Azhar and the major representatives of all four Sunni Islamic schools of jurisprudence. This ruling elaborated the following key initial point: that all of historical Palestine, having been conquered by jihad, was a permanent possession of the global Muslim Ummah community, so-called fey territory, booty or spoils, to be governed by Islamic law. The January 1956 Al-Azhar Fatwa's language and arguments are indistinguishable from those employed by Hamas, for example, in its covenant, revealing the same conjoined motivations of jihad and conspiratorial Jew hatred. And I'll read from that fatwa. Muslims cannot conclude peace with those Jews who have usurped the territory of Palestine and attacked its people and their property in any manner which allows the Jews to continue as a state in that sacred Muslim territory. As Jews have taken a part of Palestine and they're established their non-Islamic government and have also evacuated from that part most of its Muslim inhabitants, jihad to restore the country to its people is the duty of all Muslims, not just those who can undertake it. And since all Islamic countries constitute the abode of every Muslim, the jihad is imperative for both the Muslims inhabiting the territory attacked and Muslims everywhere else, because even though some sections have not been attacked directly, the attack nevertheless took place on a part of the Muslim territory, which is a legitimate residence for any Muslim. Everyone knows that from the early days of Islam to the present day, the Jews have been plotting against Islam and Muslims and the Islamic homeland. They do not propose to be content with the attack they made on Palestine and Al-Aqsa Mosque, but they plan for the possession of all Islamic territories from the Nile to the Euphrates, unquote. At present, the continual monotonous invocation by Al-Azhar clerics of anti-Semitic motifs from the Quran and other foundational Muslim texts is entirely consistent with the published writings and statements of Sheikh Mohammed Sayyid Tantawi, Grand Imam of this preeminent Islamic religious institution since 1996. Tantawi's case illustrates the prevalence and depth of sacralized normative Jew hatred in the contemporary Muslim world. Arguably, Islam's leading mainstream cleric, Grand Imam Sheikh Tantawi, embodies how the living legacy of Muslim anti-Jewish hatred and violence remains firmly rooted in mainstream Orthodox Islamic teachings, not some aberrant vision of radical Islam. Tantawi's PhD thesis, which translates as Jews in the Quran and the Traditions, was published in 1968-69 and republished in 1986. 2 years after earning his PhD, Sheikh Tantawi began teaching at Al-Azhar. In 1980, he became the head of the Tafsir, or Quranic Commentary Department, of the University of Medina, Saudi Arabia, a position he held until 1984. Sheikh Tantawi became Grand Mufti of Egypt in 1986, a position he was to hold for a decade before taking on his current post, first assumed in 1996 as the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar. My book, The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, includes extensive first-time English translations of Tantawi's academic magnum opus. Tantawi wrote these words in his 700-page treatise, Rationalizing Muslim Jew Hatred. The Quran describes the Jews with their own particular degenerate characteristics, killing the prophets of Allah, again, Quran 261, 3, 112, corrupting his words by putting them in the wrong places, consuming the people's wealth frivolously, refusal to distance themselves from the evil they do, and other ugly characteristics caused by their deep-rooted lasciviousness. Only a minority of the Jews keep their word. All Jews are not the same. The good ones become Muslims, Quran 3:113. The bad ones do not, unquote. Tantawi was apparently rewarded for this scholarly effort by being named Grand Imam of Al-Azhar in 1996, a position he still holds. These are the expressed, carefully researched views on Jews held by the nearest Muslim equivalent to a pope, the head of the most prestigious center of Muslim learning in Sunni Islam, which represents some 85 to 90% of the world's Muslims. And Sheikh Tantawi has not mollified such hate-mongering beliefs since becoming the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, as his statements on dialogue in January 1998 with Jews, the Jews as, quote, enemies of Allah, descendants of apes and pigs, April 2002, and the legitimacy of homicide bombing of Jews, also April 2002, made clear. Tantawi's statements on dialogue, which were issued shortly after he met with Israel's chief rabbi, Israel Meir Lau, in Cairo on December 15, 1997, provided him another opportunity to reaffirm his ongoing commitment to the views expressed about Jews in his PhD thesis. Here's what he said. Anyone who avoids meeting with the enemies in order to counter their dubious claims and stick fingers into their eyes is a coward. My stance stems from Allah's book, the Quran, more than 1/3 of which deals with the Jews. I wrote a dissertation dealing with them, the Jews, all their false claims and their punishment by Allah. I still believe in everything written in that dissertation, unquote. Unfortunately, Tantawi's anti-Semitic formulations are well grounded in classical mainstream Islamic theology. However, understanding and acknowledging the Quranic origins of Islamic anti-Semitism is not a justification for the unreformed, unrepentant, modern endorsement of these hateful motifs by Tantawi with predictably murderous consequences. Within days of the Netanya homicide bombing massacre on Passover Seder night, March 27, 2002, for example, Sheikh Tantawi issued an abhorrent sanction on April 4th of that year of so-called martyrdom operations, even when directed at Israeli civilians. And during November 2002, consistent with his triumphant denial, Sheikh Tantawi made the following statement in response to criticism over the virulently anti-Semitic Egyptian television series called Horsemen Without a Horse, based on the Tsarist Russia forgery of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Here's what he said. Suppose that the series has some criticism or shows some of the Jews' traits. This doesn't necessitate an uproar. The accusation of anti-Semitism was invented by the Jews as a means to pressure Arabs and Muslims to implement their schemes in the Arab and Muslim countries. So don't pay attention to them, unquote. Last January 22nd, 2008, it was reported that Tantawi canceled what would have been an historic visit to the Rome synagogue by the Imam of Rome's mosque. The putative excuse for this cancellation was Israel's self-defensive stance, a blockade, in response to acts of jihad terrorism, rocket barrages, attempted armed incursions, etc., emanating from Gaza. The Italian newspaper, to its credit, Corriere della Sera, commenting aptly about these events, observed that the cancellation proved, quote, even so-called Muslim moderates share the ideology of hate, violence, and death towards the Jewish state, unquote. Al-Azhar, Corriere della Sera further argued, which constituted a, quote, Vatican of Sunni Islam, had in effect issued a kind of fatwa. The paper concluded by noting that, quote, what the Cairo statement really means is that Muslim dialogue with Jews in Italy is only possible once Israel has been eliminated, unquote. Syrian psychiatrist Wafa Sultan's riveting new book, and I urge you all to get it as soon as it comes out, it'll be out in a few weeks, A God Who Hates, includes her written exchange with an Iraqi judge who she characterizes as broad-minded and cultured. Thus, Wafa notes her surprise when this man warned her against discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, lest she be accused of conspiring with Jews and Zionists. Wafa Sultan wrote back to the judge, quote, thanking him for his advice, though declining to take it, and explained to him that I was utterly convinced that the reasons for the conflict were religious and stemmed from Prophet Muhammad's hostility towards the Jews, unquote. She continues, in one of my messages to him, I reminded him of the Quranic verse, and she refers to Quran 564, and here's the Arbery translation. God's hand is fettered. The Jews have said God's hand is fettered are their hands, and they are cursed for what they have said. Nay, but his hands are outspread. We have cast between them enmity and hatred till the day of resurrection. As often as they light a fire for war, God will extinguish it. They hasten about the earth to do corruption there, and God loves not the workers of corruption. So Wafa continues, I asked him, is that reasonable? What do you tell your son when you read that verse to him? And parenthetically, this verse was cited by the so-called moderate Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, and it was during a speech in the West Bank, and it culminated in a call for the Palestinians to aim their rifles at the Israelis. So she asked him, is that reasonable? What do you tell your son when you read that verse to him? How can you convince him that our problem with the Jews is their occupation of Palestine rather than Islam's attitude to them 14 centuries before that occupation began? And Wafa Sultan concludes, Islam's general attitude toward the Jews helped Muslims construct their conspiracy theory and use it as a weapon against anyone who tried to cast doubts upon the credibility and morality of Islamic teachings. With the aid of this weapon, they have been largely successful in attaining their objective. Let me conclude by saying, the intellectually honest assessment and understanding of Islamic anti-Semitism and the anti-Jewish violence it begets must begin with an unapologetic analysis of the motifs of Jew hatred contained in the foundational text of Islam, the Quran, the Hadith, the Sirah, while identifying those like Sheikh Tantawi, the Sunni Muslim Pope, who continue to preach and sanction this religious bigotry regardless of their stature. Thank you very much.
Nå, ja, vi skal bare nu til snakke om Lars' bog. Og så sove ind. Okay.
We will now proceed directly to your question.